psychyogi.org. Frowd et al. 2007. The relative importance of external and external features of facial composites. Background. This is the first study we'll be looking at, from making a case and interviewing witnesses. It's further categorized into facial reconstruction. So, research by Franson, Goldstein and Chance highlight the perceptual preference for faces. This leads to increased memory of faces. Frantz showed newborns an image of three shapes, one of which resembled a face, one of which didn't quite resemble a face, and one of which was just two blocks of colour. And they found that the baby spent the longest time looking at the face, thus demonstrating an innate human preference for looking at faces. Singer's meta-analysis of stranger face reconstruction 2006 concluded with 8 key points. And before we do this, try and identify the image you see on the screen. I imagine that most of you will be able to tell that it's the Queen of England, despite the crude pixelation of the images. Singer's conclusions were that humans can recognise faces even if the mode of communication is poor, for example, in that low-resolution image. The more familiar the person is, the more likely it is that they will be recognised in low-resolution images. Therefore, facial features of familiar people are processed as a whole rather than as their component parts. Because obviously, if the people who are familiar had their internal parts processed, then we wouldn't be able to work out who it is if the photo is blurry. Yet we must be looking at these people as a whole in order to identify them when the photos are blurry. Singer found that identifying a person is heavily reliant upon eyebrows and the hairline, and both lighting and motion can influence recognition. There are specialized neurons for facial recognition, and identity and expression are processed by different cognitive systems. Something else which is interesting is something called Perrin Dolia. Now, Perrin Dolia is the human tendency to see faces where there are none. There is a video on this, and it should be in the description and on psychyogi.org in the Frowd et al. Page. The aim: to study and understand the relative recognisability of internal and external features of facial composites. The design was 3 laboratory experiments at Stirling University. Participants: for Experiment 1 there were 30 members of staff and students from Stirling University. Experiment 2 had 48 students from Stirling University. Experiment 3 had 8 members of staff and students from the computer science and psychology, and then 54 normal participants. Procedure: Experiment 1 was independent measures. The participants were shown 10 target photographs of famous people and 40 composite images produced by various computer programs. There were 3 sets of composites were used: a set of complete faces, a set containing only internal features, and a set containing only external features. The participants were randomly assigned to one of the 3 composite sets and tested individually. They were told that they will be evaluating composites of famous faces by matching them to celebrity targets. The target photographs, which were always complete faces, were placed on the table in front of each person and the relevant pile of 40 composites given. The participants were asked to work through the set sequentially by placing each composite in front of a celebrity face in their own time, but they were trying not to make exchanges once placed upon the table. Using this procedure, the composites were thus sorted. The order of presentation was randomized across the set to mix the composites from different systems. So one of the sets was used, so it is either internal, external or complete. The presentation order of targets was also randomized for each person. All the faces were clean shaven and faces with glasses on were avoided. Experiment 2. This experiment used a photo array to compare the quality of external and internal composite features of Experiment 1. While more difficult to set up than the sorting task, as a number of distractor faces, foils as they're called, must be located for each target face. The photo array task, or photo lineup, may function more as a measure of identification, such as a police lineup, given that the arrays contain foils and targets deliberately selected to be similar to each other. In Experiment 3, the results of Experiment 1 and Experiment 2 suggested that the recall of the faces focused mainly on the external features. The problem with both sets of results is that causation could not have been inferred. Therefore, Experiment 3 aimed to establish that causation and find out if limited exposure of the faces or unfamiliar nature of the faces was to blame. Results. Experiment 1. Both the complete composites and the external composites were sorted with similar results, with around 35% correct, whereas the internal composites were only around 19.5% correct. Experiment 2. External composites were 42% correct, and external were identified only 24% of the time correctly. Experiment 3. Both complete faces and external faces were matched with the same level of accuracy, which suggested was significantly greater than those of the external faces. Conclusions. The results of this study suggest that there is something about internal faces of a face which impair cognitive reconstruction of that face, even when the face is familiar, so that of the celebrities. Evaluation. Because it's a laboratory experiment, it's high in controls, and we can say it's highly valid because they did attempt to first find a correlation and then they went and found causation. There are 3 different experiments. One of the problems is, of course, ethnocentrism. They were all students or staff from Stirling University. Now, that doesn't really generalise to the actual population, nor is this ecologically valid in terms of a forensic setting. So, if we're looking at the police lineup, yes, it may be similar to that, but it's not similar to the first time the person saw the face. If you've enjoyed this Psych Yogi presentation, why not subscribe to keep up with all the latest videos.